And tonight's topic is life after death in the Christian tradition. We're going to focus a lot on sort of the early period and then kind of end with kind of where we are today and look at some of the creeds and some of the statements that we make as Christians today. So Richard already did it, but just a real quick review of kind of the key points that brought us to where we are tonight. Let's looking at this idea of the biblical background. Old Testament, Richard said it, there's not much there. Couple of examples, and these are both of resurrection of the body. So you have in Isaiah 26, for your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise, for the earth will give birth to those long dead. Most scholars say that this is one of the two pretty clear indications of life after death, that this likely is not talking about Israel as a nation, but individuals. And it's probably a very late addition to the book of Isaiah. Isaiah has layers and layers of material that were contributed over a couple of centuries. And this is the section, 2 chapters that most scholars say are the last additions. And then, of course, the one in Daniel. At that time, your people shall be delivered. This is the last chapter of our version of Daniel. Everyone who's been found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So you have both an affirmation of life after death and sort of a judgment and sort of the beginnings of a heaven and a hell. We'll explore next week those concepts in more detail. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness in the sky. This is something we find in Enoch, we find it in Daniel, and a couple other places, the idea of shining like the stars. And those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Now, belief in life after death then, not much in the Old Testament, just a little bit at the very end, and probably both those examples were written 2 centuries after the Old Testament was supposedly closed, 400 BC. Both of those are probably from the 2nd century BC. So it's during this rich period in between the Testaments that we've been studying on Monday night, the books of the Apocrypha. And not all of that period, but most scholars say it's really the Maccabean period and the crisis of faith during that time that begins to generate this literature. So Enoch, for those of you who are in the Apocryphal study on Monday, I've just finished doing the material on Enoch, so we are going to cover that in detail in a few weeks. I know a mystery. I have read the heavenly tablets. I have seen the holy book. So Enoch is getting information here that otherwise you would not have. I have found written and inscribed on them this regarding the dead. So here comes the affirmation, that all goodness and joy and glory has been prepared for those who have died. Don't need to worry about it. It will be wonderful. And manifold good shall be given to them as a reward for their labors. And their spirits, not soul language, not body language, but spirit language, shall not perish. And that their lot is abundantly beyond and better than the lot of the living. And the spirits of those who have died in righteousness shall live again, and they shall rejoice. 7th son story from Maccabees. Very literal kind of feeling for the resurrection idea when he was his last. This is the 7th son. They've all been systematically tortured to death. And so the last son, before he dies, they're about to cut his tongue out. They're about to cut his hands off and then kill him. And he says, you dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life. When it was demanded, he quickly put out his tongue, courageously stretched forth his hands, and said, I got these from heaven, and from God I hope to get them back again. So very literal. And then we did have that one sort of passage in wisdom that sort of talks about life after death in the terms of immortality of the soul. The souls of the righteous are in the hand of God. No torment will ever touch them. In the eyes of the foolish, they seem to have died. Their departure was thought to be a disaster. And they're going from us to be their end. But they are at peace. For though in the sight of others they have perished, their hope is in immortality. So we've got soul and we've got immortality. The righteous live forever, and the reward is with the Lord. The Most High takes care of them. Some of you may have been to funerals where this is a text that's read very often at Catholic funerals, but also Episcopal and occasionally in a Methodist. That means that by the time of Jesus, there are two options on the table in terms of life after death. This would be the world of Jesus. If you're in Palestine, if you're a Palestinian Jew, Hebrew, Aramaic speaking, you have a belief in resurrection of the body and that you will get a new physical body. This belief was not just for restoration of individuals, but we even have the idea that God will restore all of creation, sort of bringing it full circle back to the Garden of Eden. We have that in Paul. We have that in Revelation. If you are a Jew not in Palestine, if you're anywhere else in the Greco-Roman world, you likely have a different belief, one that's more in line with the Greco-Roman thinking. Not for the continued or renewed existence of a physical body, but belief in a non-physical, non-material existence. This goes back to Plato. It actually goes back further than him, but Plato articulated it really well. The belief that you have a soul that is immortal and that can survive the body. Now, the earliest Christians in and around Palestine clearly had a preference for one of these two options. We started out as a movement within Judaism. We probably were a movement within Judaism until the early 2nd century. So not surprising, we came out of Palestine, we came out of Judaism. So which of the beliefs do you think is more likely? Well, pretty clear. It's universally and unanimously expressed in hope of resurrection. That's why in the New Testament, immortality of the soul is never mentioned. Resurrection of the body is mentioned many, many times. This belief was based, as Paul tells us, on the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. If Christ be not raised, then our faith be in vain, he says. Paul believed and others believed that what God had done for Jesus, God would do for us. Therefore, Jesus was, as Paul says, the first fruits, but not the last. Language of the immortal soul is missing from the earliest Christian tradition. It simply is not there at all, which is going to throw us for a shock as we roll forward. Does not appear in the New Testament. Only the Apostle Paul uses the terms immortal and immortality, but for Paul, what is immortal is not the soul. You may remember it is the body that is immortal. 1 Corinthians 15:53, this perishable body must put on imperishability. This mortal body must put on immortality. I was having a conversation earlier today with one of our members about, why would Paul have this? I think probably the easiest way to think of this is that in the world of first century Judaism, this is just the limits of their thinking. They're thinking bodily. God is the creation of the physical universe. Everything has a body. So whatever God has for us, it must have a body. And Paul is part of that. But in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul, as Richard indicated, puts a new idea on the table. Not the raising of a normal physical body of flesh and blood, which Paul says cannot inherit the kingdom of God. That was in verse 50. And not an existence in the soul that is immortal. Richard mentioned that. Both of those, no. Paul gives a third option, one we've not seen before, this idea of a spiritual body. It's bodily, it's a part of God's creation, so it has a body, but it's not flesh and blood, so it's spiritual. So it's Paul's balancing two terms here, and he's sort of cutting some new direction. At the close of the New Testament, the landscape is very different from Christian faith belief today. Today, if you would argue for, as N.T. Wright does, bodily resurrection, you're going to get a lot of pushback. It's clear that in the first century and with the New Testament, Christianity opted initially to continue to express its belief in life after death in the Jewish idea of the resurrection of a physical body. rejecting immortality of the soul as a way of expressing its hope for life after death. Yet today, very few Christians believe in the resurrection of the body. The vast majority believe in the soul, and the vast majority believe in the immortality of the soul. Culturally, if you just think about how we handle life after death or what happens, beyond death, culturally, you enter the world about ghosts and spirits and mediums and psychics. What's interesting about that is none of that has anything to do with bodies. It all has to do essentially with concepts about the soul, a non-physical survival beyond the grave. Now, the language of resurrection is almost entirely missing from this landscape, even among Christians. Raises the question, what happened? And when did this fundamental shift take place? When did we reject the early Christian and New Testament belief in resurrection and replace it with an entirely different one? This is not a new issue. We know that Paul was dealing with it in the 50s as he has taken the gospel that came out of a Jewish world, and he's proclaiming that gospel to Gentiles or to Greco-Romans, and they're having difficulty. Christians in Corinth find it hard to believe in the resurrection of a physical body, so they're believing in a spiritual deal. So in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? Well, the point there is they are saying that. And they're simply not buying this Jewish idea. It's too crass, too primitive, I'm not sure, but they're not buying it. Paul has to defend the belief, the traditional Jewish belief in resurrection at Corinth. He has to do this because some Gentile Christians find this belief a bridge too far. This is a part of the faith they cannot embrace. This struggle did not go away and intensified. And the balance begins to shift almost immediately away from the resurrection and in favor of immortality of the soul, but not immediately. As we look at the early church fathers here, there's a period of transition. We're going to see this shift in what are known as the early church fathers during the 2nd through the 4th centuries. The early church fathers are basically those before Constantine. So figure the New Testament is written in the 1st century. So the early church fathers are the 2nd century, the 100s, the 3rd century, the 200s, and maybe really early in the 300s. And then you have later church fathers. These fathers are all, to a person, part of the Greco-Roman thought world. None of them live in Palestine. They're in Rome, they're in Alexandria, they're in Antioch, they're in Corinth, they're in Ephesus, they're all over the map. But what they have in common is that they're all essentially Greco-Romans in their thought. As Christianity moved out of Palestine into the larger Greco-Roman world, and as Judaism and its thought began to fade, Greco-Roman thought and Greco-Roman philosophy began to have an increasing impact on the shaping of how the Christian faith is expressed. In the Greco-Roman world, resurrection of the body did not make sense. Immortality of the soul did. So what we're going to do tonight is look at this transition. Now, little sidebar here. The early church fathers, if you're like me, you probably did not know much about them, or you may not know much about them, but they're important. They're important because they are the bridge from one belief to another. It's in the early church fathers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries that a lot happens. Scholars have said, for example, more happens in a very short period of time of central importance than in the next 1,800 years combined. And in a sense, we've just been refining and polishing what was laid down the first 2 centuries. In the Protestant world, of which we are a part of, the authority of the fathers is second only to that of Scripture. I want to give you 2 examples of this. This is Martin Luther's letter, written in 1519, so right in the height of all the conflict. He says this: I believe that it will be impossible to reform the church if we do not root out, get rid of, banish the canons, that's the law, the laws of the church, the decretals, that's things said by the Pope, scholastic philosophy, which is the ruling theology of the time, and logic as we have now. All that's got to go. What are you going to replace it with? Replace them with the Bible and with the church fathers. John Wesley has a sermon called on laying the foundations. And for him, the early church fathers represented the religion of the primitive church, the whole church, and the purest ages. In another place, he says this: the fathers, the early church fathers, are the most authentic commentators on Scripture, for they are nearest to the fountain, they're the earliest, and were eminently imbued by the Spirit by whom all Scripture is given. So, Luther, Wesley, Calvin, Zwingli, the Protestant leaders, the church fathers are very important. Now, at first, as we look at the church fathers, at first, many like Paul continued to affirm the resurrection of the body. And sometimes it's more literal than Paul. I'm going to give you two examples. Like Paul, they're having to defend this belief against those who reject it. You know, they're taking this traditional Christian faith that came out of Judaism, and they're trying to protect its integrity by saying resurrection is still important. So, St. Clement, second letter, roughly 150 AD. Clement says this. He's, by the way, in North Africa. I'm sorry, he's actually, and this Clement is from Rome. And let none of you say that this flesh is not judged and does not rise again. Think about this. In what state were you saved? Well, in your body. In what state did you recover your sight? If it was not while you were in this flesh. We must therefore guard the flesh as the temple of God. For just as you were called in the flesh, so you will come to God in the flesh. So, hard line, right down the center for resurrection. If Christ the Lord who saved us became flesh, and in that state called us, so also we will receive our reward in this flesh. Hard line. A few decades later, first one was from about the year 150. This is writing about the year 200, Tertullian, fighting the same battle. And by the way, he's in a different place, different location. He says this, well, that it's clear he's battling the same thing. He's battling the idea of the immortality of the soul. So this is what he says. It's a treatise on resurrection. If God raises not men entire, that means body and all, he raises not the dead. Thus our flesh shall remain even after the resurrection, as it is the flesh, and the same flesh too. A little later in the treatise, he says this, and so the flesh shall rise again, holy, and every man, in its own identity, in its absolute integrity. Now with Origen, roughly same time period, we find an early church father who begins to soften this position. He likes what Paul had to say about that third option. So this is what, and he's going to pick up on Paul's idea of the spiritual body. So this is what Origen says. We now turn our attention to some of our own believers who either from feebleness of the intellect or want of proper instruction, he's not too impressed with them, opt a very low and object view of the resurrection of the body. We ask these persons in what manner they understand that the physical body is to be changed, that's Paul's term, by the grace of the resurrection and become a spiritual one. Key terms, changed and spiritual body, he's opting for Paul's understanding. But how do they understand the declaration from the apostle, we shall all be changed? This transformation clearly is to be looked for. It becomes us to hope for something worthy of the divine grace. We believe that this will take place in the order in which the apostle describes. He's really reading 1 Corinthians 15 here, and he's arguing for Paul's view. The sowing in the ground of a bare grain of corn, that's the image that Paul uses, 1 Corinthians 15, to which God gives a body as it pleases him. For in the same way also our bodies are to fall into the earth like a grain, or buried. And although the bodies die and become corrupted and are scattered abroad, they shall be raised again. So 2 examples of pretty hard line resurrection. Origen kind of bringing in Paul, but still arguing for resurrection. So it's clear. Many of the early church fathers, particularly at the earliest level, continue to champion belief in the resurrection, and they are willing to fight for it. And yet, during this same time period, we begin to see signs of a shift. Beginning in the 2nd century, the exact time we were just hearing voices from, there are other voices, and they are using strikingly different language. First, it's half steps, shifting from language of the body to language of the soul, but without affirming that the soul is immortal in and of itself. So, for example, Justin Martyr here, who is as early as any of these people we've talked about, Justin Martyr's in Rome. This is what he has to say. For the power to live is not an attribute of the soul as it is of God. You know, life does not reside in the soul. Okay. God gives life to souls as he pleases. So he's using the soul language, but he's not making the claim of Plato that a soul is immortal in and of itself. So we're using soul, but he's redefining a little bit. All created things have the nature of decay and are such as may be blotted out and cease to exist. Tatian, also from about the year 150. The soul is not in itself immortal, O Greeks, but mortal. So arguing against Plato, but using the language. Yet it is possible for it not to die. So we've got a soul. It's not immortal, but it may not die, which is the definition of immortal. Now, what is striking is that these voices overlap with the voices who refuse to use language of the soul. So what we have in the 2nd century, some voices, resurrection of the body, some voices, the soul, and even hinting at the immortality. But by the 3rd century, by the year 200, the focus will shift almost entirely from resurrection of the body to the soul. This is one of the most striking features of the early church period. One door closes and another door opens. This is the letter of Matthias to Diogenes, about the year 200. Again, same time period we've been looking at. The immortal soul, there it is. This is a Christian writer. The immortal soul dwells in a mortal tabernacle. Plato would agree with that. Christians dwell as sojourners, just temporarily, in corruptible bodies, looking for an incorruptible dwelling in the heavens. Again, some of kind of Pauline-ish language. Now, this was going on pretty generally. As the church moved out into the Roman world, we began to leave behind more and more of our Jewish roots and begin to embrace more and more of the broader culture. We always do that, whatever culture we're in. So we're beginning to see more Greek philosophy come on. Christians are now putting, to use the image of Jesus, they're putting the new wine of the faith into new wineskins of Greek philosophical thought. It's clear that some of the early church fought this trend and believed the use of Greek thought was a mistake. So Tertullian, again, look at the date, about 200, very early, has a very famous passage you may have heard of, in which he just rails against the use of Greek thought. You probably have seen this before. For philosophy is the material of the world's wisdom. That's not a compliment. The rash interpreter of the nature and dispensation of God. Indeed, heresies are themselves instigated by philosophy. What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? That's the famous comment. What is the academy, the Plato Academy in Athens, to do with the church? What have heretics do with Christians? So Athens, academy, heretics, Jerusalem, church, Christians. He's drawing a hard line. Our instruction comes from the ports of Solomon, which was part of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, who had himself taught that the Lord should be sought in simplicity of heart, away with all attempts to produce a Stoic, Platonic, or dialectic Christianity. But his protests are in vain. The faith of Jerusalem is going to be expressed in the language of Athens. By the early Middle Ages, this is the 500s, Rome has fallen, we're moving into the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages. Belief in immortality of the soul has totally and completely replaced belief in the resurrection of the body. What you see there is there's just simply no references to the resurrection of the body. Everything is soul and immortality. When we get to Thomas Aquinas at the height of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas lays down the principle that will be sort of the official theology. Matter of fact, even today, Thomas Aquinas' thought is considered the official theology of the Roman Catholic Church. But remember, at this time, there is only one church. It's the Catholic, this meant everybody. So this was official thinking of the church. It asserts that the soul is immaterial, that there's nothing material or bodily to it, has no body. So the soul could exist without the body. The shift from belief in the resurrection of the body to belief in an immortal soul shows up in the way that the creeds have changed across the centuries. This is sort of the last section we're going to deal with tonight. Ancient creeds are unanimous in affirming the resurrection. For example, the two great creeds we know are the Apostles and the Nicene. The Apostles' Creed, we say it almost every week back at the church. I believe in the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. By the way, that wording is probably in place around the year 100 to 150, somewhere in there. Same time as some of the authors have been looking at. The Nicene Creed, written 325 and rewritten in 384, says this: we look for the resurrection of the dead and the life in the world to come. Now, there's a subtle shift here between the 2nd century and the 4th. Both creeds use the language of resurrection. Apostles' Creed, 2nd century, affirms the resurrection of the body. Nicene Creed, 4th century, affirms resurrection of the dead. Is there a difference? Yes. It makes no reference to a body. So in the Greco-Roman world, resurrection of the dead would be much easier to accept. This is a subtle but significant shift, and it foreshadows what is to come. We clearly see the result of this development in the later creeds. The great creed of the Reformation, remember that Martin Luther, we have the Augsburg Confession and a couple of other confessions, the Heidelberg Confession. Interestingly, those confessions do not mention anything about life after death, one way or the other. The one creed that comes out of the Reformation is the Westminster Confession. This is the Reformed tradition out of Scotland, and this will become, of course, the Presbyterian Church. Number 32 says this: the bodies of men after death return to dust and see corruption, but their souls, there it is, which neither die nor sleep, having an immortal substance. Plato could argue with nothing here. Immediately return to God who gave them. This is like in the story of the thief on the cross, today you would be in paradise. The souls of the righteous, being then made perfect in holiness, are received into the highest heavens. And that would be sort of mainstream Christian thought, Reformation afterwards. Now, You may know that in our United Methodist Book of Worship and Discipline, we actually have 4 different creeds that we use. What is interesting is that none of the 4, none, mention resurrection of the body. We have the modern affirmation, which expresses only the Christian hope that the kingdom of God shall come upon the earth. Does not say anything about our individual hope. Makes no reference to life after death at all. The Korean creed, or the creed of the Methodist Church in Korea, does reference life after death, but makes no reference to resurrection. It simply says, we believe in the life everlasting. The new creed, which comes out of the Canada, and the Methodist Church as a part of the United Church of Canada, mentions neither resurrection nor life everlasting. It only asserts a generic hope, and it's beautifully said, but in life and death and life beyond death, God is with us. We are not alone. By the way, in looking at these, this is something for us to kind of talk about tonight. It's just interesting that the modern creeds that we have, all of them, multiple, have opted not to use language of resurrection and not to use language of immortality, but to keep it more general and generic. Today, you may have seen these statistics before. The vast majority of Christians indicate that they believe in immortality of soul. This is not the population of the United States. This is people who self-identify as Christians. 72%, according to Pew Research, only done about 4 months ago, 72% say they understand life after death in terms of immortality. That's roughly 3 out of 4. Only about a third expect to be resurrected in the body, 37%. So it tells you that some people in there have some kind of a combination of resurrection and immortality. Again, this is Pew Research about 4 months ago.